Thank you. I didn't hear the introduction, but somehow it elicited a nice warm welcome, so I'm very grateful. And it's wonderful to be back here in the hall. We're going to have a discussion mainly, not a lecture, but I'll just start with a few optimistic thoughts for 2020. Soon, President Bernie Sanders is going to change American policy. And I will tell him you said so, and he will be very happy. Maybe you can have him here early in his new presidency. The world's a little bit weird right now, and actually, it is true, unstable and dangerous. And it is unstable and dangerous because of the cast of characters that we have in high public life in many places in the world. In the United States, we have, without question, the worst president in American history and the most dangerous president we've ever had. We've probably had two psychopaths as president. I can't vouch for Andrew Jackson, but I can vouch for Donald Trump. The man is absolutely psychopathic and extremely dangerous and delusional. And so we can't be completely optimistic as long as he's president because we live in danger. And the political assassination of Soleimani a couple of weeks ago is an example. I think premeditated murder out of the Oval Office is not only despicable, but it's the kind of thing that can absolutely wreck the world. And so that's the downside. The upside is that most people in most places in the world are not psychopathic. The estimate is that it's about 2% of the human population, and that means that we're okay, the 98%, and there is worldwide a desire for peace and for normalcy and for getting on with solving some very important problems in the world, like climate change and other environmental crises. And the truly good news is that for almost every major crisis that we have solutions. We're living in a period, as you know better than I do, of unbelievable advances in know-how, technology, capacity to do things if we direct our energy and attention in the right way. So we're not lacking for instruments to solve problems. We could, if we chose to do so, save millions of lives per year of vulnerable people who are dying of stupid, unnecessary reasons. There are no fundamental reasons for war ever, by the way, but there are no fundamental reasons for war between the US and Iran right now. This is a kind of imbecility and ignorance of history, not some deep geopolitics. There's no reason for a fundamental new Cold War between between China and the United States, except in the fantasy minds of some American hardliners. So we're not lacking for a way forward. And indeed, some people write books saying it's the best of times, and why are people unhappy? We've never had it so good. It's not quite like that because we're in great danger, so it's not as if everything's wonderful. But what is right about those analyses is that it could be a lot better. So I hope what we can talk about tonight is some problem solving. What can be done? How do we address some of the big challenges that we do face? How could politics really work in the way that politics is supposed to, in quotation marks, at least according to Aristotle, maybe not according to Machiavelli, but according to a view of politics as the collective will of a society for well-being. That's how I would view politics, the collective action for eudaimonia, as Aristotle would have said it. How could we move in that direction? I'm not going to tell you yet. You're going to have to ask in ways that interest you. But fundamentally, I'm a believer that we can solve the problems that we have, and that our biggest problems are a lack of knowledge of what to do, and of course, politics that are flawed but are fixable. We in the United States, we're going to fix them this year. We really will. The bully will be gone, and we'll at least break a little bit out of this craziness that we've been in. And then we're going to find that there's a lot we can do. So I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight. And who would like to start?
We're actually going to start with a Q&A.
We're going to start here.
Move to the audience.
You see, I don't know the script, but I will be a polite guest, so I'm going to sit down. We're going to talk, and then you're going to ask questions too.
So thank you so much for joining us here today. Like I said in my introduction, we're so happy that this is our first event of the year. So just reflecting on the past decade to see how we can move, like you said, in a positive direction for the 2020s, and looking at the progress that we've made towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, what do you think the biggest setbacks and the biggest breakthroughs were?
The biggest, maybe the only big breakthrough of the last 10 years is that we agreed to have some breakthroughs. In 2015, the world's governments agreed on two big things. I'm putting a lot of stock in them, even though the mere fact of an agreement doesn't prove anything. In September 2015, September 25th, 2015, the world's governments agreed on so-called Agenda 2030, or the Sustainable Development Goals. This is pretty good. 193 governments said that sustainable development should be the organizing principle for global cooperation. Then a few weeks later, on December 12th, 2015, the same governments agreed on the Paris Agreement on climate. This was a very important agreement because it codified for the first time what we intend to do. We have a treaty that was already agreed 28 years ago at the Rio Earth Summit, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it said something important. It said that the aim of countries was to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. That's the legal term of what we're supposed to be doing, stopping the greenhouse gas emission concentrations from rising to avoid dangerous human-induced climate change. But we never acted on it. And then on December 12, 2015, the governments more or less described what that phrase means by saying we aim to stay well below 2 degrees C warming and aim to take efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Okay. By the way, that's not very safe, those limits. And it's also very hard to achieve at the same time. So it's a kind of a middle ground between rising dangers and already being so late in the day. But these were the achievements of the last 10 years, actually, 2 big goals. Now, neither of them is really being implemented. And so a cynic would be well placed to say, so that's the best you can say, that we announce 2 goals that aren't being implemented. And my view is a little bit better than that, which is that the fact of having globally agreed goals is an extraordinarily important handhold on a very slippery slope, to mix terrible metaphors. But we need to not fall into the kind of chaos of politics which a Trump or Bolsonaro or others would bring us to, and having some clear goals that have been set and universally agreed, and that are good goals and make sense, and that are ambitious and meaningful, are very, very important. So I spend every day trying to help achieve those 2 objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. And the world's tough because first we have to keep the Sustainable Development Goals secret from Donald Trump. So if you go to Washington, don't mention them because he tried to ruin them, but he doesn't know them, so we don't, we're not telling him. And so far, Washington has been completely innocent of the SDGs. He is trying to wreck the Paris Climate Agreement because American politics is so damn corrupt that the oil money has completely bought the Republican Party, and we are in the fight to overcome that. But my wife and I travel nonstop pretty much around the world, and there are a lot of governments and a lot of universities and a lot of businesses even that are intent on actually achieving these goals. There are some that are intent on not achieving them, like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips and other big oil companies. And there are a lot of governments that are just absolutely awful, starting with my own. But that's politics. That's the fight we're in right now. And it's not impossible to win this fight. In fact, all the logic is we should be able to win this fight. The goals make sense. I mean, SDG 3 says everybody should have health care. Well, is that really so hard? No. SDG 4 says every kid should have an education. I mean, my God, we're in 2020. Is that really so hard? The truth is 260 million kids are not in school right now because they live in conflict zones or they're impoverished, and their parents are impoverished, their governments are impoverished. But if we cared, of course you could get the schools and you could get the kids in school and so on. So in this sense, that's our real politics. And we shouldn't shy away from it because the issues are good. The goals are utterly achievable. The people who are fighting them are, like Trump, psychopaths or greedy or just don't know about them yet. And so that's what we have to make our politics about. So that's the good news. We've got a good fight in this decade to really make some big accomplishments, and I think we can do it.
So just looking at the coming decade and the fight that you mentioned, what do you pin down as the largest obstacles in the way of achieving the goals?
Trump is number one, because the United States has 700 military bases around the world, 6,000 plus nuclear warheads, and a psychopathic president. Other than that, nothing to worry about. And the capacity to start a war, which would devastate everything. So That's the biggest enemy is war, by far. If we stay in peace, we'll solve these problems. That's corollary number one, I would say, if we avoid disaster. Unfortunately, even small wars, quote unquote, like Iraq, which was just the stupidest war of the modern period, can disrupt a lot for many years and take attention away from important things. So staying at peace is the most important thing. And what do we really confront? With all wars, we confront the risk of demagogues and human nature. So human nature is that we're easily triggered by fear. We are easily triggered into identity politics. Americans are very susceptible to be told Iranians are your enemy, but I doubt that 10% of Americans could find Iran on a map, and probably that's an exaggeration. Maybe only 3% could. By the way, when the first Gulf War broke out, I'm just remembering, I flew over to England on a 747, I think it was, but it was a big jet. And the war had broken out a couple of days before. I think I was giving the Robbins lectures at LSE, maybe. And the plane was completely empty when I got on board. There were about 3 people on the airplane. And apparently I asked, what is going on? Because weird to fly in a jumbo and have no one there. And the explanation I was given, which seemed perfectly plausible to me, was, well, Americans think that the Persian Gulf is right next to London, so they don't want to fly into a war zone, and that seemed absolutely likely to me as the explanation. So I do have a rule for peace, by the way, which I commend to you if you could help make it into a law. I want America to have a law that says America cannot go to war against a country unless at least 50% of Americans can name 2 cities in that country. Because if we had that, we would have perpetual peace, in the words of Immanuel Kant.
And just again on the topic of the goals and the climate agreement, the European Green Deal was recently announced by the European Commission, and you described it as a global benchmark. Can you tell us a bit more about the deal and what's so great about it, essentially?
So Europe is in the lead on climate, and it's in the lead for one overwhelming reason, and that is Europe has very few fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are a kind of psychotropic drug. If you have coal, oil, or gas, you go crazy. You go crazy with greed, you go crazy with necessity, it takes over your politics, and oil has been the center of politics of the United States, Russia, Canada, of all places, such a nice country, but too much oil. Australia, another very nice country, but too much coal. And all of these places share Rupert Murdoch also. Well, he's the biggest disaster on the planet in terms of media. And so Europe doesn't have fossil fuel because you guys invented the Industrial Revolution and used up all your coal, thank you. That was the last century, so there's no more coal in this country. And so Britain, United Kingdom, at least for the time being, can be green because it's not a coal country anymore. And there's very little coal left in Europe, just little pockets. And wherever you see those little pockets of coal, there's opposition to doing something about climate change, by the way. If it's Poland, because of its tiny coal industry, we're against doing something on climate change. Germany just went through a kind of agony to close down its coal plants, and they announced a few days ago a good plan to phase out by 2038 the remaining lignite mines, which is a tiny part of the economy, but a big part of the politics. Well, to make a short story long, as I'm doing, Europe has very little fossil fuel, and so it can think clearly. Hell, we're getting wrecked. The climate change is a mass danger to us and to humanity. And Europe's a very sophisticated part of the world, I think the most sophisticated part of the world. And so it has adopted a climate strategy. And the strategy that was adopted a few weeks ago, first by the Commission and then by the European Council, is the European Green Deal. It's really worth your reading this. It's a very good document. It is basically a rather comprehensive climate, pollution, biodiversity framework with the idea of full decarbonization of the energy system by 2050. And so it's a serious set of goals, very bureaucratic. This committee, this structure, this law, wonderful, because that's what we need. We need Weberian bureaucracy to set absolutely rational, logical, organizational strategies. This is not something that is just will. This is something that has to be boring. You have to implement something for 30 years. And so the European Commission, good at boring, so it set out a good, comprehensive, detailed plan for these three dimensions of environmental sustainability: climate change, land use sustainability, and fighting pollutants like plastics. So in this sense, it's the best thing around. And I decided I would spend this year carrying it around, as we did to Southeast Asia when my wife and I were visiting Cambodia, Laos, and Malaysia last week, saying, you guys need an ASEAN Green Deal. Because it's the same story. 10 countries in ASEAN, 650 million people. It's major. This is a big part of the world. And so if ASEAN would have a Green Deal, that would be a great complement for Europe. And my real hope is ignore Donald Trump for a moment and get on with 2020 with a European Green Deal, an ASEAN Green Deal, and I'm hoping, this is a little bit of a stretch, but not impossible, of a Europe-China agreement on a comprehensive environmental program that would link together the Belt and Road Initiative and the European Sustainable Investment Plan. Because Europe needs to invest heavily in modern infrastructure. China is creating the Belt and Road Initiative, which unfortunately right now is not a very clean initiative. It's building a lot of coal plants in partner countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. And my idea is the EU should say, we will cooperate together. We'll build a Eurasian 21st century infrastructure stretching from East Asia through Central Asia, Western Asia to Europe. We'll do it together. We'll finance it, European Investment Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on. But it's got to be clean. It's got to be zero carbon. It's got to be sustainable. To my mind, that would be a great deal for China, because the US is trying to create a Cold War with China. This is close to insanity, but it is part of an American political tradition, which I can elaborate on, of needing an enemy. Not just needing an enemy. China's a little different. Hating a competitor, I should say. So China's really a competitor for the United States. and the US doesn't like competitors. And so it's trying to get the world to gang up on China. That's very dangerous and a very bad idea. Buy Huawei is my advice. And when the US says it's insane to go with Huawei, that's a good advertisement that something is probably good about their phones and their 5G. And but China should know also, look, we don't want a Cold War with you, but on the other hand, China's the #1 greenhouse emitting country in the world by far now. About 30% of global greenhouse emissions are coming from China. And that's because such a big country and such a coal-based country. And so the deal with China, in my view, is clean up and we partner and we ignore the silliness coming from Washington. And that's what I hope Europe would do. So in this sense, I view the European Green Deal as not only a significant advance of European policy, because I really think it is, but literally a template for building a coalition that we urgently need for real climate action. We don't have a coalition right now. We don't have real climate action in the world, actually. We still have a continuing trend in the wrong direction. We haven't even turned the curve yet. And so Europe is the first one that will turn the curve for sure, mainly because Europe is blessed with no fossil fuel and a good understanding and capacity to address this issue. And if that template could be made into real geopolitics, then we're going to get somewhere.
Just on the topic of global cooperation, you've obviously worked quite closely with consecutive UN Secretary Generals. What's your response to critics who cite inaction and bureaucracy as insurmountable failures of the institution?
The biggest barrier of the UN is that it's based on a 1945 reality that is very hard to adjust. The UN is the most important creation we have for peace, bar none in the world. So you guys have to champion the UN, and you're going to also have to fix it as well. We're going to have the 75th anniversary of the UN this year, actually. So it's a good time to think about it. The UN is essential. The UN Charter is very important because it basically says we will solve our problems peacefully. It is against international law to make threats or to go to war, except for self-defense. And if everybody abides by that, you don't have the self-defense need. Article 51, or whatever it is, Chapter 51. So the UN is really important. And it's really a neat place also. I like hanging out there a lot, as I've been doing for the last 20 years, because 193 governments talk to each other. And diplomats are also really cool. They smile all the time. They're very polite, even when they're talking to people, in governments that would like to kill them. And so it's a wonderful organization. It's got one serious challenge and then 100 practical challenges. The serious challenge is that it was invented by the United States, and I think it was one of the finest creations of the United States in US history. And it was invented by the greatest president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. But it was created with a view that America would basically be lead. So 5 countries were given permanent status in the UN Security Council and given a veto over any change in the UN Charter. And those 5, of course, are the US, the UK, France, it was the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China. And this is paralyzing, in a way, this veto. It means that within the Security Council, any one of the P5 can stop an agreement. And it means that the UN Charter can't be amended. And one of the practical things that needs to be amended is the Security Council itself, because, for example, the world is 2/3 Asian. About 65% of the world population is Asian. But the representation on the Security Council is only 3 of the 15 seats, only 1 of which is permanent, China, and 2 are rotating. But it's 1 out of 5, 20% Asian in the Security Council, but 65% of the world is Asian. So that's a huge discontinuity. And it means that there's a fundamental legitimacy problem. Well, all of this is really the main reason why the UN doesn't work like it should. The extreme power of a few countries, and especially the United States, the host country, and until recently, the undisputed leading country in the world, the most powerful country, the richest country, the most technologically advanced country. And our politics went sour on the UN, not in public opinion, but in the Republican Party already 25 years ago, because Republican Party is a really weird institution, and became rather anti-UN, and a lot of other things happened. So now Trump is kind of vulgarly anti-UN, and Nikki Haley, lest you have, she was our ambassador up until recently. I don't know our new ambassador. I don't even remember her name, I'm afraid. But Nikki Haley used to go around literally saying, and I was in some of those meetings, why should we support this institution when you don't vote for us? Which is a little crude for a diplomat. The US right now is putting really terrible burdens on the UN in terms of budget and practicalities of action. And the US, is breaking the international consensus on just about everything. It's the rogue state in the world right now. It's the only one pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It is the only country that abandoned the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, which was supported unanimously by the UN Security Council, and then Trump pulled out. And there are a host of other agreements where the US is basically the only holdout in the world right now. This puts the UN at a lot of stress. If it was majority vote, it wouldn't matter at all. But it's the US, it's the host institution, and it's a problem. Okay, if you got rid of all that, there would then be bureaucracy, there would be organizational issues, there would be functionality of large organizations which are not entirely functional sometimes. But on the whole, the real problem is politics. The real problem is not bureaucracy and so forth. That's symptomatic of an institution where the key powers don't necessarily want it to work.
Thank you. On that note, I think we can move to audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the mic to come to you, and please stand up to ask your question. Could we go to the hand in the second row, in the scarf?
Hi, so thank you for that. You talked a lot about how the people fighting climate change or fighting action against climate change are these oil companies and other corporate interests. And how do you think they justify like their long-term investments with the fact that climate change might have very destabilizing effects on those investments? And do you think we'll see a change in their attitudes as the effects of climate change become more visible? Or
Yeah.
do you think they'll continue to hold this line?
So let me say, first of all, on the political economy of this, it is three kinds of actors, all fossil fuel based. First, it's the states, the governments, where fossil fuels are produced. Because in some places, it's not really the companies. It's not Saudi Aramco that determines this. This is the Saudi state. It's an oil-based country entirely in its economics, fiscal policy, everything, of course. So the state is one key actor. The second is companies, when you have companies that are not the state. So that's the US situation to an important extent. It's also true in Australia with coal mining, in Canada, and so on. There's, a real distinction between the state and the companies. And then the third is the regions. Regional politics matters a lot. If you're in a coal-producing US state like Wyoming, well, the state's politics will not be so green, typically. So when I talk about fossil fuel interests, it's a little bit broader than just the companies. And the real power is government making decisions and laws, because the only way we're going to get out of this crisis is not through market mechanisms and so on. We're going to outlaw fossil fuels, basically. We won't outlaw them from one day to the next. We will phase them out. And what we'll do eventually when we do this, and it could be soon or it could be too late, we'll do what we did with chlorofluorocarbons in fighting the ozone depletion, because that's the only environmental treaty that's really delivered basically all that was asked for it. And what we did with chlorofluorocarbons in the Montreal Protocol was to outlaw them. We said, you will phase out both the production and the consumption of CFCs over a period of years. And that turned out to be basically a decade, as short as that. Now, that was one chemical used in a limited number of industrial processes, but it was phased out. That's what we'll do with fossil fuels. We will say, you are not allowed to build any more thermal power plants, because we know how to do that, can run a grid that way, and that's what we should be doing. We will say sometime soon, I believe, maybe as early as 2030, you will not sell any more internal combustion engine vehicles, because we'll go to electric. And that will be a mass shift, with some exception of synthetic fuels. So this will be done in a regulatory way, and that means the government really will drive this process fundamentally. And we'll reach a tipping point, and maybe it's not far off. It seems very far off now, but maybe in 5 years it won't, we'll actually even have hit the tipping point. But the companies play a role. They play an independent role, especially in capitalist countries like the United States. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know what goes through their minds, first of all, because they have children. That's the first point. These are executives that run companies, and they know that they're doing incredible damage. I talk to a lot of the executives, and they say, well, you need oil. And it ain't true, because we now can plan a deliberate phase out certainly over a 30-year period, which is what we should do. And so it's not true what they say, but they believe it partly because of the echo chamber. They talk to each other. And they believe, Sachs, you're a little naive. You know, yeah, we're going to do it, but maybe not on your timetable. And there is ignorance, which we really need to appreciate. I once spoke to senior utility company executives in the United States. And, you know, these are top CEOs. And in the room, one of them raised their hands after I spoke. This was 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, so it's not an immediate point. But he said, Mr. Sachs, you're saying you believe this climate change issue. And I was dumbfounded because most of the climate denial is just bullshit. It's not real denial. It's just, and it's not even ignorance. It's just a game. But this was a CEO of a major utility. And I realized he reads the Wall Street Journal. Okay, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is a joke. It's designed to get me mad in the morning. That's all it is. I think they must deliver. I sometimes think they deliver a special issue just to my doorstep because it's a bunch of ignorant, stupid lies in Rupert Murdoch's newspaper each day about climate change. Well, apparently some people believe that also, which is another reason for this. But basically, it is probably true. I don't know whether H.L. Mencken said it or Mark Twain said it, but the old line that you can't convince a person of something when his salary believes on believing something else is probably also true. There's just a lot of cognitive dissonance that is, maybe especially afflicts executives of oil companies. I get a lot of love emails, you can imagine. That's sarcastic. I get a lot of hate emails, and I got one last week, rather irate about an op-ed that I wrote on climate change. And I like to respond to these to be polite and also sociological interest to try to understand what's going on. And so the person that wrote to me wrote a rather sophisticated letter, but it was a climate denial letter. You know, surely you don't believe this, Mr. Sachs, but with a few interesting adjectives. And, you know, how could they let you teach, that kind of thing. And so I wrote back, and we went on for about 4 or 5 interchanges, and he kept sending me climate denial literature, and I kept saying, could you send me something peer-reviewed, maybe? Then we could talk about it, and he said, yes, but it's such a conspiracy to get into the journals, so I don't want to send peer review because they don't do this. And then he sent me something of Richard Lindzen, who was a neighbor of mine, who's a kind of a climate denier, emeritus professor from MIT. But it wasn't peer reviewed. And I said, yes, I've seen this many times. You know, this stuff just isn't believed. And then finally, it ended I said, thank you very much. It's been lovely to speak with you and or to correspond with you. And he sent me one more time, and I said, oh God, how am I ever going to get rid of this now? And I wrote back, I thought we had agreed, thank you, but you know, thank you for this. If you do find something in the peer-reviewed literature, let me know. Then he wrote back, okay, Mr. Sachs, I really appreciate our conversation. I've been an energy executive for the last 37 years, and he kind of let loose. Okay, he's an oil guy. And in his milieu, this is the stuff they read. And it's silly, but it exists, and it is a kind of way to be an oil executive and to read stuff and to believe what you're doing. But the vast majority of Americans don't believe it anymore because they're getting floods and droughts and storms. And so even in my crazy country, it's a little strange country, by the way, we now have about 80% public opinion that says do something about climate change. It doesn't change anything about our politics yet, but public opinion is on the right side. So we'll get down to the fact that it'll be Donald Trump and 4 oil executives will be the last holdouts. That's probably what's going to happen.
Another question. Could we go to the hand over there, please?
Thank you, Mr. Sachs, for your speech and your very sensible idea, very agreeable ideas. That's why I'm just throw a pretty provocative thing just to spark the discussion, which is, didn't you omit, okay, you said that most SDGs are easily achievable if people would care, but didn't you omit the fact that the 2 degrees goal is not achievable even if we had a 30 years phasing out of the fossil fuels, even if we had the World Green Deal or Chinese New Silk Road Green Deal, a sustainable one. And isn't it a good reason why you should actually advocate for, I don't know, happy degrowth, for the abolition of the capitalist system, or the stopping of like most of the consumerist economic activities that we have here in the global north? Why not?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think it's a good question. What is achievable, and what does that mean for the state of affairs and for the economic system and political system? I don't think it's feasible without economic calamity to decarbonize well before 2050, okay? And the reason is that we probably could not do so without a major loss of economic activity. So my scenario is a kind of smooth scenario where you phase out the existing fossil fuel plants over a 30-year period. Take the German case right now, they'll phase out all lignite and coal by 2038, okay? And they'll do that now. And New York State has said we'll have 100% green energy green power by 2040, and so on. So my scenario is we phase out the fossil fuels by 2050. That's a huge stretch because we're nowhere on that trajectory, but it's feasible without economic upheaval, okay? And you could, if you stopped new sales of internal combustion engines by 2030, like I mentioned, automobile lifespans are basically 15 years. And so by 2050, the whole fleet of vehicles would be zero emission. Okay, what would we get if we do that? Probably we would get peak temperature. Well, the IPCC says we would get a peak temperature probably in a band of 1.5 to 1.6 degrees, and by the end of the century below 1.5 degrees. So maybe like this. In other words, decarbonizing by mid-century meets the 1.5 degrees C. Now, that may not be safe enough. We're at 1.15 degrees warming right now compared to the pre-industrial level, approximately. It depends baselines and measurement and which year and if there's an El Nino and so forth. So don't hold me to the second decimal point. But we're basically a little bit above 1.1 degrees C warming already. And we're on a trajectory of 0.2 degrees C per decade if we continue business as usual. So maybe in 20, 30 years, we're already above 1.5. Okay, it's going to be a close call to hold it at that level, but it's probably just feasible if the impeachment process goes well next week and Senator Sanders introduces the Green New Deal in his first month of office, which he will do. Okay, it may not be safe enough for a couple of reasons. One is that could be a climate tipping point already. We know that there are positive feedbacks in the climate system, and 1.5 degrees could be enough to carry us to 3 degrees. It's possible. Another possibility, which is not known, is that 1.5 degrees is enough to lead to a rather massive, well, certainly massive, but rather sudden, which means, say, in a 50-year horizon, rise of sea level of multi-meter. Because there's good evidence that even at 1.5 degrees C, we will have a multi-meter rise of sea levels and devastate places like Bangladesh. So the idea of 1.5, by the way, is not to sit there, but to come back down, because we want to get down to no more warming than 1 degree. That puts us within the band of the Holocene, of the 10,000 years of civilization. Okay. Long story short, we can probably do that, actually. Bend the curve, peak at around 1.5, get down to even end the century at 1.4, 1.5, pointing downward, and with normal good luck, reach relative safety with a lot of disasters between now and then, because we're already having disasters. Okay, that's the good scenario. What if the climate emergency is much, much more drastic, which it could be? Well, then we're going to have calamity one way or another. What I would tell you is the following. We have 7.7 billion people on the planet. There is no low-tech or reversible way to feed, clothe, keep safe 7.7 billion people in a low energy use environment, for example. Impossible. There's no low-tech way for global safety. There's no easy way out of this. An economic collapse that lowers greenhouse gas emissions is no friend to billions of people. So avoiding an economic calamity is not just because you care about the stock market or you want consumption at a certain level. That's not my motivation for that. My motivation is that the world economy is a pretty sophisticated, it's a very sophisticated but fragile system. And if the system is broken, we will have disaster, because there are a lot of people in the world that depend, all of us getting on clean water, power, transport, food supply, shipments every single day. And so I don't want to have an economic upheaval. I want to have a smooth transformation. Then comes the question, well, can this be done in, quote, capitalism? And there, first of all big words have to be handled carefully. Capitalism is a big word, and by big word, I mean it covers so many ideas that are ill-defined if it's one word. For example, my favorite part of the world in terms of policy and politics is Scandinavia. I'm a social democrat. That's my ideological view. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, to my mind, okay, the best we have it in humanity. The best balance of normalcy, equality, decency, prosperity, sanity, rationality, honesty of government, and so on. So they're capitalist by some definition, but nothing like the United States capitalism. So it's too big a word. So if you ask me, could the whole world exist as a social democratic Scandinavian model, I'd say, hallelujah. Yes, of course, that's a great system. It shows how you can have freedom, private enterprise, democracy, sanity, honesty. I love the fact, have people here watched Borgen? Anybody know the Danish House of Cards? Have people watched House of Cards? I know it's a few years out of date. Okay, in House of Cards, I was always impressed, in Borgen, which is the Danish version of House of Cards, there's one scandal in 3 seasons, and that is that the prime minister, by accident, uses his official credit card to buy a purchase for his wife, and then doesn't have time to reverse the purchase by Monday because his aide has a heart attack in the meantime. Okay, that's Danish drama. All right. In House of Cards, the president kills several people. That's American politics. So I go with the Scandinavian version. And if you ask me, could we have Scandinavian-style capitalism worldwide and get through the crisis? Of course we could. So that's what I believe in, that we need social democracy. Social democracy means tax yourselves heavily and ensure universal access to economic needs as the basic philosophy. And also have a social ethos that if you're rich, you're a little bit suspicious. And if you're rich and greedy, you're outside the social norm. Where in America, if you're rich and not greedy, you're a little crazy. So that is why I don't think that capitalism is the right definition for our concern.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. But thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking Professor Sachs.